James Bond is undeniably one of the greatest and most recognisable franchises in the history of cinema, and as we begin to approach whatever the next chapter of Bond will look like, I think it's worth looking back on what is probably my favourite Bond film of the franchise, 1995's Goldeneye. I think Goldeneye is particularly relevant to today's Bond as well, as there's a lot of similarities that can be drawn to the situation of how that film came to be and how the next iteration of Bond is forming. Both Goldeneye and the upcoming 26th Bond film share contextual similarities in their development. Both were being made at times where the future of Bond was in question, in a changing world where some felt that the character was too dated and in need of a refresh. What was impressive about Goldeneye was that it managed to evolve the franchise and yet retain the very same DNA that makes Bond so iconic in the first place. To this day, Goldeneye remains one of Bond's best on-screen outings, so in this video, I will explore why Goldeneye is not only such a strong entry into the Bond series, but also why it's a perfect blueprint for what may be the best path for the next chapter of the Bond franchise to follow. Much like how Bond 26 will introduce a new actor into the role, 1995's Goldeneye did the very same thing, with that film being Pierce Brosnan's very first outing as 007. What was impressive about Brosnan's portrayal is how well suited he is to the role.
You were expecting someone else?
He not only looks and sounds like a James Bond, but he also has the acting range to make him a more believable take on the character. The boyish charms and innuendos of Bond past are very much present in this interpretation.
It appears we share the same passions. 3, anyway.
I count 2. Motoring and baccarat.
8 pour la banque. 7, Madame wins.
I hope the 3rd is where your real talent lies.
One rises to meet a challenge. How long did you say the fuse was?
Oh, grow up, 007.
But so too is the intensity needed to make him a believable blunt instrument when the story needs him to be. In interviews since, Brosnan describes his interpretation as walking the line between Sean Connery and Roger Moore's interpretations of the character, and I think that Brosnan does this brilliantly.
For me, it was trying to walk a line between Roger and Sean Connery and not being shy of taking from their work. I was so enamored by Sean Connery, who I'd seen as a boy of 11 years of age in Goldfinger, and I watched him transcend to the heady heights of being Bond and creating such an iconic character.
Oh, no, you don't. This is no time to be rescued.
Then came Roger, and I watched Roger portray the character. So I took from both men, really. I allowed myself the grace to be able to try and get the sense of humor that both men brought to the part.
Do you destroy every vehicle you get into?
Standard operating procedure.
You kind of have your own private work that you deal with as an actor in trying to portray this man. It's pretty overwhelming. And then providing your own truthfulness. Can you make a truthful moment out of this scene?
I think this is one of the reasons why he's such a popular version of Bond as well, because audiences who grew up either in the Connery or Moore era of Bond films can see their childhood iterations in Brosnan's Bond portrayal. This creative decision makes a version of Bond with a more universal appeal to the wide-ranging tastes of an audience who've watched the Bond franchise for decades already. And I believe that this would be quite a good lesson to take into Bond 26's casting and creative decisions around that actor's portrayal of the character. To simply copy and repeat what Daniel Craig did would feel cheap, and I don't think that audiences would respond to that type of Bond in the same way as they did under Daniel Craig. Instead, after such a distinctly gritty and more grounded take on the character, I feel that the next Bond needs to walk the line between gritty realism and also having a more humorous charm about him. which was missing in the Daniel Craig era for the most part. This is another point of comparison to Goldeneye, as Brosnan's Bond followed a very gritty and realistic and serious Bond with Timothy Dalton's 2 films prior to it. If they did do this, it would give the new era to the franchise a clearly defined new tone which acts as a clean break from the Daniel Craig era, which would be beneficial in distinguishing this new chapter of Bond's history from the last. Now, one element that I found was slightly weaker in the Daniel Craig era of Bond films is the action sequences. Across all 5 Bond films that he was present in, whilst there were certainly occasionally good moments such as the car roll in Casino Royale, the helicopter sequence at the start of Spectre, and the opening car chase of No Time to Die, none of the action, to me, felt as iconic as some of the previous entries. Having watched every single James Bond film in order from 1962's Dr. No to 2021's No Time to Die, I'm fully aware that the action of the James Bond films varies substantially. Very early films in the series don't feature as many action sequences as later ones. But one of the things I did really enjoy about the Roger Moore era of Bond in particular was that it had so many iconic action sequences. Whether it be the boat chase in Live and Let Die, the ski chase in The Spy Who Loved Me, or my absolute favourite in the whole Bond series, the Lotus chase, also in The Spy Who Loved Me. What all those sequences had in common was that they were super memorable and rewatchable. This was something that carried over well into the Brosnan era of Bond, notably in Goldeneye. In that single film we have one of my favourite opening action sequences, which immediately highlights to the audience the capabilities of this new version of Bond. From the bungee jump and opening sequence, to the car race between himself and Xenia Onatopp, to the tank chase through St. Petersburg, all the way through to the final fight with Alec Trevelyan, this Bond film has highly original and memorable action sequences, and each is so memorable due to how inventive they are. All on that list go above and beyond the usual type of chase or stunt sequence seen in countless Hollywood blockbusters. But in the Daniel Craig era, the action doesn't feel quite so inventive anymore, at least to me. I'll be curious to see if anybody else agrees with me in the comments, but for me, it's been the later editions of the Mission Impossible series which have overtaken the Bond franchise in recent years in pioneering practical action sequences in Hollywood blockbusters. Films like Mission Impossible Fallout and Dead Reckoning in particular have the scale of action one expects from a Bond film. And much like a Bond film, those films have highly memorable action sequences such as the helicopter chase in Fallout or the bike jump and train sequences of Dead Reckoning. Nowadays, people talk about the Mission Impossible series as the biggest action films, whereas that title used to belong to Bond. And now that the Mission Impossible series is over, well, at the least for the time being, now is the perfect time for Bond to get back onto the throne of being the king of the action film series. Let's get back into breaking some records, like that bungee jump at the start of Goldeneye did back in 1995. That sequence was shot in the Contra Dam in Ticino, Switzerland, and the bungee jump was a whopping 720 feet jump. At the time, it was the new record for the highest bungee jump off a fixed structure. The stunt was performed by stunt performer Wayne Michaels, who you can actually also see in the movie as he plays one of the Tiger helicopter pilots. My main point here is that we need Bond films to be doing what Tom Cruise has been doing for the past 10 years. They're supposed to be at the absolute pinnacle of the action genre, and whilst they put out some reasonably solid action sequences in the Craig era, none feel quite as larger than life and iconic as what we've found in eras past. So this is something that I think Bond 26 could also learn from Goldeneye. It acts as another way to notably mark this new Bond film as an instantly iconic classic too, and a way of guaranteeing a baseline level of coolness for the next iteration of the character. Even the place Goldeneye was made was innovative and groundbreaking for the UK film industry. Eon Productions, the company behind the Bond films, always shot their Bond films at Pinewood Studios in England. But when the time came to shoot Goldeneye, the movie First Night was filming there, meaning that studio couldn't be used. Eon Productions instead found a disused Rolls-Royce factory in Hertfordshire and converted that into a new studio. That studio being named Leavesden. Now, the list of major films in cinema history that have since been shot there is massive. From Mission Impossible Rogue Nation and Fallout, Wonder Woman, Fast and Furious 9 and 10, House of the Dragon, Wonka, Barbie, The Batman, Spider-Man, Harry Potter, Paddington, and most recently Beetlejuice 2, and many, 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 many more. Just look it up, the list is massive. Now, that studio happened because the people behind Bond weren't prepared to wait for Pinewood to be vacant. They instead were innovative and thought outside the box, using their massive budgets to their advantage, with their efforts not only enabling GoldenEye to be made, but giving a space in which so many iconic films and shows would be shot in the years that followed. Leavesden, following more developments over the years, is now one of the largest and most state-of-the-art filmmaking facilities in the world. My point here was that Bond films were not only a major player in cinema, but they were also a major source of innovation, and creative industries, particularly film in this example, work best when boundaries are constantly being tested and pushed, because it means that films try to outdo what's already been done, and therefore things feel fresh. Now that's hard to do, and it gets progressively harder the further the limits are pushed, and it's easy to think that the limits have been reached, that filmmaking can go no further. But people have been screaming that for decades about all forms of art, and even though examples of exceeding the boundaries become less frequent, they do still exist and continue to happen. And I know I keep mentioning it, but in terms of action, the latter Mission Impossible films have been the litmus test that proves that. I believe Bond, to stay relevant in this new era, needs to return to this, in becoming boundary pushing in its action, its filmmaking techniques, its story, its costume design and sets, and therefore the next era can stay as genre defining and as significant as what's come before. This is actually something that I think will continue to be the case, particularly with director Denis Villeneuve being attached to direct Bond 26. As shown in his previous filmography, particularly the Dune films that he's recently made, they are not only shot practically in real locations, but they're films made at the very cutting edge of cinematography and sound design. So I have faith that he will bring a similar level of craftsmanship to the Bond franchise. Leading on from this, we then have the question of story. There's lots of speculation as to where the franchise should go next. Some feel it should travel back, reinvent itself into a period piece of the 60s or the 50s, and perhaps adapt the books more faithfully. People like it when franchises adapt things closely and accurately, and given the Bond films of the past generally tend to play with the source material quite loosely, then it would be different enough to justify such a move. Notably too, the writer attached to direct Bond 26, Stephen Knight, is best known for his period pieces such as Peaky Blinders and the underrated SAS Rogue Heroes, so I wouldn't be surprised if the chosen direction for the character does end up being a 50s or 60s setting. However, I have a different take that I feel might be a better next step, and that step is originality. Now, I know that's practically a heretical concept in modern Hollywood filmmaking, but just hear me out first. Goldeneye was the first film in the Bond franchise that was completely original. It referenced no specific work of Ian Fleming's, neither the novels or his short stories. In fact, the film was named after his estate that he lived in, and it worked. In fact, it worked really well, and the box office for that film proves it. Now, bear in mind that the figures I'm about to give are relative to 1995 and not subject to modern inflation, but the film cost only $60 million to make and made $356.4 million at the global box office. In today's world, where anything less than $1 billion is strangely perceived as not much of a hit, That doesn't sound like too much, but for the time, it was a massive hit. For another point of reference to prove this, the box office revenue for Goldeneye was an 83% increase from its predecessor, License to Kill. What this shows then is that Goldeneye was able to be a massive hit without relying on any specific Bond source material, demonstrating that the character is capable of life beyond the support of any of its original books. Part of the reason that it worked so well was because the plot of Goldeneye was so strong, and it also explored relevant concepts to the time, yet simultaneously ensuring that despite the world around him changing, the character of James Bond stays fundamentally the same. And I believe that this is exactly the direction that the next Bond film needs to take. Bond is, in the words of M,
a blunt instrument.
And the very best Bond films carefully walk the line between humanizing Bond and keeping him as that blunt instrument. Goldeneye does this brilliantly through the film's villain, Alec Trevelyan, a former ally of Bond who turns villainous. We see a Bond who is clearly hurt to see what has become of his old friend, but also a Bond who is quite comfortable with killing him in the end to ensure that he succeeds in his mission. Brosnan's Bond, then, whilst he clearly has some elements of humanity to him, that element is ultimately kept in check by the blunt instrument his training from MI6 made him into. It was also a wise move to jump right into an already established Bond, rather than a Bond only just starting his adventures. Casino Royale was the Bond origin story film, and much like with Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man, we don't need more origin stories from any of them because, quite frankly, we've seen it, and sometimes we've seen it multiple times. So, as the most recent versions of those characters have skipped past the origin story stages, Bond 26, I believe, should do the same. Returning back to the plot of Goldeneye for a second, another thing that made the plot work so well was because Alec as a villain was both a personal and professional threat to Bond, and the tension that generates in the character between man and mission is conceptually intriguing as a dynamic to explore with the Bond character. It's why it pops up again in other Bond films, such as in Casino Royale with Bond's relationship with Vesper. The tension between duty and personal need is an interesting concept to explore with a spy, and it challenges the idea of Bond being a blunt instrument in rather interesting ways. Goldeneye is a legendary Bond film, and one that 30 years on from its release holds up as one of the franchise's best entries. It succeeds in delivering an interesting story with superb action sequences and a great portrayal of Bond who marries together the different eras of tone from the Bond franchise, creating a universally iconic and beloved entry in the series. And for those reasons, along with the contextual similarities to its development, I think that Goldeneye is a film that Bond 26 should take notes from. Whether it does, only time will tell, but what we do know now is that no matter what happens next with the Bond films, we always have Goldeneye to watch again. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and if you're interested in seeing more reviews and analysis on your favourite movies and shows, please do like and subscribe if you wouldn't mind doing so. Thank you.